walked up here, you probably immediately grasped what this talk is going to be about. This might be one of the few national conferences where somebody could come up on stage wearing a Roman collar, a shirt with the word autism, and playing with a little STEM toy. I'm one of the few Christian ministers who has been diagnosed with autism and who is also public and talks about it. And I want to include some ideas here for how local churches can include those in the spectrum, those autistics, within their services. First, however, a little bit about myself. I'm a Catholic priest, an autistic Catholic priest. I always felt a little bit out of place as a kid. I was never the popular kid, but there was nothing that was like so obvious that I was ever diagnosed at that point. But there's a lot of things in my family. The diagnostic criteria have changed a lot. If you look through my family at the extended family, including those who have passed away, there's a few who have certain kind of autistic traits. Not that they would be diagnosed, but they have traits in that direction. In psychology, you can be diagnosed with the condition because you have all the diagnostic criteria, or you can have traits where you kind of tend that way, but you aren't diagnosed. You don't really fully have that condition. And my family is very much into science, research, and engineering, things like that. Right now, I'm a candidate for a doctoral thesis in moral theology on privacy. So if you ever want to know about privacy, I'm kind of an expert on that too, the moral implications of privacy, but that's not our concern today. But in that family, if you go from my grandparents down, there's 12 of us, and I would be the fourth one in those 3 generations to have a doctoral degree, which means a third of us will have doctoral degrees, which is pretty high. And so in my second year of computer engineering, which was kind of following the family pattern, my degree before I entered the seminary, I felt God calling me to enter the seminary right after second year. I kind of did fine in the seminary, nothing really, no giant red flags. I mean, I had some difficulties, but I don't think anybody gets through the seminary without any difficulties at all. But then after I was ordained, I was assigned to be chaplain at a Catholic school. A pretty normal assignment for a new priest, new minister. I worked for a year. I made a few mistakes, I thought. But then they're like, we don't want you coming back next year. And I'm like, what? I mean, you realize you got a guy right out of the seminary, so I assume you're going to give me a little, leeway to make a few mistakes because we're all human. But what happened was that I totally missed on reading kids' emotions, reading their social cues, and trying to act neurotypical, that is not autistic, all day while I'm around at the school, whereas in my other situations, I was spending a lot of time studying and things like that in the seminary, or I was working out in ministry before. I was doing kind of youth groups where I'd spend the evening, a few hours, kind of doing that, but then most of the day I'd be prepping and things like that because the kids are in school. So about a year later, I got a formal diagnosis, and at the moment I was devastated. I was really, what's happening? But then, as I thought about it, as I looked at it going forward, and I read up, it actually helped me understand so many things in my life. I remember asking a few times whether everyone just did things subconsciously, because I had to put in a lot of conscious effort to be even okay at them. And they're all like, yeah, I guess so. I never even really thought about whether I was doing that. Things like reading social emotions and things like that. It's almost like I managed to get an okay distinguishing things between different colors. And then when I'm in my 30s, I'm diagnosed as colorblind. All of a sudden it's like, oh wow, like I'm missing that whole ability to distinguish those two colors really. But I managed to piece together an okay one where I don't look like a total fool. Now, after I was diagnosed, I made 2 decisions about ministry. The first one was that I was going to go public, both for my own good, so that then if something seems a little off, people will say, oh, he's autistic, not like, oh, he's not being a good person, and whatever else they might think of, a pastor or things like that who acts a little strange. And Also for those who are on the spectrum who need help from an autistic minister. And the second decision was really trying to fit my talents as a smart but autistic Catholic priest into the types of ministries that priests do. And so with that, that's what led to my doctoral thesis to become a seminary professor, writer, or something like that, because I'm very good at expressing myself in writing, and I'm pretty smart. I got into a doctoral program with no problem. So that area might be better because it does involve some social reading, but not nearly as much. And so if we go into autism, it isn't kind of like one thing. It's not like, oh, a kid does this one thing and therefore they're autistic. It's more along the lines of if you check 6 of 10 boxes, you're autistic. And so there is a saying among the community that if you met one autistic person, you met one autistic person, because we all vary so much. Because with having to check 6 out of 10 boxes, 2 people might only overlap in 2 of those 10 boxes. Or on the same sense, some of those boxes are kind of variations where they might be totally different, because one box is sensory irregularities, for example. Now, sensory irregularities can be hypersensitivity or hyposensitivity. Hypersensitivity is oversensitivity, which is kind of the stereotypical, where there's the autistic who's always in his dark room and barely turns on any lights and things. And the hyposensitive is insensitive, where, for myself, I look like hyposensitive when you come into my office because it's bright. It's so bright that people comment on it when they come into my office. But at the same time, when I go outside, I'm one of the first persons to put on those sunglasses, because I think I have a smaller range of enjoyable light intensity than the average person. And I just manage, it's close enough that I can manage to operate more or less in a normal environment most of the time. Now, let's look at a few of these boxes, a few of these traits. 2 small notes first. First of all, the 6 of 10 boxes is not by any means a clinical diagnostic criteria. It's like certain things and certain categories. And it's much more complicated, but I just tried to simplify it into something I could say in one line rather than making this all about how to diagnose someone on the spectrum. There's plenty of resources online if you want more details on that. Second, I'm going to focus on the aspects that are specific to autism, because I'm sure, at least in the original sense of this talk, which was at Key Ministry InclusionFest Live, where there were going to be a whole bunch of other speakers on different disability issues, the kind of things that are general to all people with disabilities will be covered in the other talks. And I think also you can find plenty of resources for those online, but not as many for including specifically those on the spectrum, which are, now with the latest things, about 2% of the population. 1 in 54 was the latest thing released by the CDC last week. So first, we have that many autistics have sensory issues, like I mentioned. And when people try and do videos showing autism, from the inside, they tend to emphasize this aspect. I was planning on showing a video here that was made by an autism charity, but distinguishing live versus pre-recorded on YouTube is that if I'm going to just post it as the video on YouTube, they want a licensing fee, and I'm poor. I don't have the money for that, so sorry. Let me explain it instead. Imagine if every fluorescent light flashed like a strobe light. Or imagine if what most of consider normal sounds sounded like claws on a chalkboard or nails on a chalkboard, or somebody banging a pot or pan a foot from your head. Or imagine if the tag in the back of your shirt felt like a cat's claw digging into your back. These are the types of things that autistics describe when asked to talk about their hypersensitivity. And the issue for us is not so much the senses themselves, but the brain and how it processes those senses. For example, some autistics can have a very loud sound, but then will have difficulty if 2 or 3 people are talking at the same time, even if they're much lower sound, because it's in how they process it, and they're trying to process 2 or 3 voices and get overwhelmed, not so much the volume. So that's important to realize. Now this, for small groups, is generally pretty easy to make these accessible in this way. You might have to check a few things like the fluorescent light issue, but for the most part, small groups don't have huge sensory issues. On the other hand, worship often has a lot more of a challenge, because there's music, there's lights, there's sometimes incense, there's, all kinds of things going on at once. So this can be a challenge for being overwhelmed, where autistic will have all these senses coming in, have trouble processing them, and the difficulty is that if we get that overwhelming for a certain amount of time, then we tend to go down to shutdown or meltdown, where shutdown is just where we stop acting, and a meltdown looks to those outside like a temper tantrum almost. Those of us who are adults on the spectrum often realize when these things are coming and just leave the situation to avoid making a public scene, even if we end up shutting down or melting down at home or in our room or whatever, to avoid the issues. Now, with worship, a contemporary worship style can be even stronger because of just all the more lights, more sound, and things like that, versus a more traditional worship style. One of the easiest ways to deal with this in worship is what's called, what people have started calling the reverse cry room. So the idea is that most churches, not everyone, has a space in the back that's kind of glassed off. You can see into the main sanctuary, but it's glassed off, and it's usually used for crying babies or similar things like that. But if on one service of the week, instead of having that as a space for crying babies, you have it for autistics and other people who have sensory issues, so that you turn down the lights, turn down the volume, all these things in there, and you don't allow in the crying babies to make all that extra sensory noise, that can be a huge help for autistics. Sometimes some churches can have a separate service for them, or a group of churches together can do that, to turn down the lights, turn down the sound altogether. And in the same sense, it's also important to realize the issue with fluorescent lights, because fluorescent lights actually turn on and off many times a second, and most of us just perceive it as a constant light because it's turning off and on so fast. But a decent percentage of autistics will see that flash, and it almost seems like being under a strobe light, which most of us probably don't want to be under a strobe light for an extended period of time. We might be under it for a song or something, but we're not going to sit under a strobe light voluntarily for an extended period. Secondly, autistics often struggle with social communication and social interaction and nonverbal communication. As noticed above, this was what led to my diagnosis. I was not picking up on the kids' social, emotional things, their kind of nonverbal communication when I was the chaplain to a school. Some struggle with this so much they're not able to do it all. Others, like myself, can do it with effort, but it's still barely a passable level. It's by no means, the suave level that most people aspire to, that we often kind of perceive as what we'd hope for in a pastor. Oftentimes you hope the pastor even has this above the average person. And so the effort is because I'm doing this consciously, whereas most of you are doing it subconsciously. Like, I can look at somebody's face and I'm like, oh, their mouth's doing that, so that could mean this, and all these things. And most of you are like, yeah, they're smiling, and I can tell they're authentically happy versus unauthentically happy. Whereas I can tell you all the little details that you can use to distinguish that, because that's the only way I process it consciously like that. Now imagine, for example, for a similar thing, imagine if every step we took, I need to think about every muscle contraction. Most of us walk, and all we consciously think of is like next step, and we move. And our brain subconsciously takes care of all those different movements. But just imagine if to take 2 or 3 steps, I had to think of every single contraction and relaxation of every muscle in there. It would be incredible. Most of us, this is part of the reason, beyond just strength, why babies have trouble walking, because they're trying to think of each one of those motions and trying to get them coordinated properly, because there's a whole bunch of muscles working for me to take a few steps. Related to this is just, we can often have trouble identifying faces, so just give us a little bit of slack. Some have full prosopagnosia, which is face blindness, where they can't even recognize people in their own family. Many of us will have to ask your name like 20 times, or have embarrassing situations like one time me and somebody else were tweeting about something, and I thought they were on like watching the event on live stream, but they were sitting like 2 seats over from me, and I'd seen them beforehand, but I hadn't recognized them. I'd met them only a few times beforehand. Not giving names, but it was kind of an awkward situation. Why? Because I didn't recognize their face, even though they were sitting like 2 seats away from me, and I'd seen their face beforehand. I didn't connect the face to the name that we were discussing the live stream on the internet, on social media while it was happening. For participation in worship, this nonverbal communication is not so much of an issue, but it can be a huge issue in small groups. If you have several people on the spectrum, several autistics in your church, it would be recommended as the easiest way is just to say, okay, why don't we make an autistic small group, an autistic Bible study, all of you get together, because we autistics can tend to understand each other better than we understand other people. The big difficulty is between neurotypicals and autistics and autistics, not within each group. But since we're only 1 out of 54 people, it's more of an issue there. Like, it's hard for us to find within that 1 out of 54 a whole bunch of other people to form a small group. And if that doesn't work, think of how you can work with them to do social relationships. A lot of times it's really simple things, explaining how you feel or asking them how they feel. Sometimes for us, if we don't feel like we receive from you a kind of trust, we'll give you the social scripts. Most of us who go around in a more or less adult way, no social scripts. So no, if you say, how are you doing? The proper response in a social script manner is, fine, how about you? But we also are not going to be dishonest if we go beyond that social script, if we actually tell you, if we actually trust you enough. So it's building up that trust, working with us where we are. So hopefully that's helpful. Most people are going to get what you see, get your emotions from your face. I might not. Some autistics almost definitely won't. As well with this, please realize we can be awkward and we can seem rude, but it's almost never intentional. For those who are willingly going to church and willingly participating in church, we are very serious in trying to follow the gospel, of trying to follow charity. But sometimes we just don't realize it. And I think an analogy is kind of when you're talking with someone who doesn't understand our language. For a while, I was teaching English to native Spanish speakers in the seminary because we had a whole bunch of young men come from Latin America. And I guess I have pretty good English. But one of the most interesting things was we saw the Passion of the Christ, the movie, before it came out as seminarians, and we got a pre-screening. And afterwards, we got into the bus to go back to the house, and I ended up sitting beside one of these young men who just came from Latin America, and he says, "What did you think about the snack in that movie?" And I'm thinking, the snack. I've been to many movies with snacks, but I don't remember one snack in that movie. That was like the most anti-snack movie I've ever seen. And so I'm kind of like, what are you talking about? And he says, oh, when in the garden, Jesus steps on the head of the snack. Now, realizing he was just a person learning English, I could recognize that in Spanish, they don't distinguish snack and snake because they don't distinguish those vowels. And he's just unaware that he's making something that sounds ridiculous. And so in a similar way, when an autistic person does something that seems rude, I think it's also incumbent upon us in ministry to try and look and try and see if that was intentional, because most of the time it probably won't be an accident. And to just kind of accept it, laugh it off, that's life. Now, when speaking, words have denotative and connotative meanings. I know this sounds like advanced literary here. It's not that difficult. Denotative means what the meaning is. A dog, a mammalian four-legged carnivore that hunts in packs and has a wet nose or something like that, to distinguish it from cats or something like that. Now, that's kind of a definition. That's the connotative. Now, the denotative is more of the implied things. Like, for instance, we might say as a total joke, someone might say as a total joke, oh, let's go and jump in the lake. And an autistic person might not realize that's obviously a total joke and might be getting on their clothes and trying to find their swimsuit to go out and jump in the lake, because they're taking a more literal connotative meaning of jump in the lake and applying that the denotative meaning when many really mean it's just like, that's ridiculous. I remember this happened to me one time. A national director of my group was coming, and I made one little mistake cleaning one. Somebody made a joke about it, and I didn't realize it was a joke beforehand. And I spent the whole meeting worrying about this little mistake I made in cleaning. And in the end, they just said, oh, it was just a joke. And they didn't even think it was a big enough deal to apologize. And I wasted like that whole meeting worrying about that. Now, briefly, there's just a few other things. We have schedules and repeated behaviors. A lot of autistics will do repeated behaviors in church, and we just accept it. Like, I came up and I was playing with my fidget toy here. This is a Tango Junior, if you're wondering. Many will do like flapping like this or things like that, which is great. And that's a positive. That's often to deal with our issues of sensory processing, where we are trying to process things sometimes externally because we don't naturally just do it internally like most people. And the other aspect is schedules. So we like to know what's going on. We often like the same over and over again. And one aspect of this is just how worship is done. For non-liturgical churches, this could be a big challenge because let's say an autistic comes to your service, and if he doesn't know if there's going to be 2 songs or 5 songs before the preacher comes on, that might be a difficulty to understand. Liturgical churches have a certain advantage of schedules because they have a consistent schedule. If I go to almost any Catholic church in the world on a Sunday, I know that they'll begin with 1 song, then a few opening prayers, then 4 readings, then the preaching, then the creed, then another song, then a prayer of consecration, then the Lord's Prayer, then communion, then a few more prayers, and a final song. And that's structured, and even elements within that structure will stay the same everywhere, every weekend. And that gives me a solid foundation to know what's going on. Maybe some less liturgical churches are as strict in that. They always have 4 songs, preaching, 3 songs, or whatever. As someone who's only visited those type of churches a handful of times, I haven't noticed that consistency, but it might be there. I don't claim to be an expert on non-liturgical churches. Finally, there's an important lesson of helping autistics not just receive, but give. Bob Quinlan of the National Catholic Partnership of Disabilities told this to me. I was recording a video on a gathering of Catholics, and I recorded the video, got my formal diagnosis within the week before I edited that video. And so it was very striking to listen to this for me. And he said, regarding people with disabilities, I'm not just trying to help them out in a one-way channel that comes back and helps me. I want to help them to become good, to help them give back as they can, to really go out and serve. There's a handful of Christian ministers who's talked about their own diagnosis, their own life on the spectrum. Dr. Lamar Hardwick, who's an African-American Baptist pastor from down in Georgia, and myself have both given more extensive ones. I gave a brief bio at the intro, but if you Google either of those, you'll find a lot more. And I think that autistic gifts are still underutilized in the church. We should make the church environment so it include autistics, and with things like a reverse cry room or handing them a program so they know what the schedule is. But we shouldn't just stop there. We should find ways so that people on the spectrum can use all their talents to build up the church. Now, just to note, this talk was originally scheduled for InclusionFest Live of Key Ministry in the middle of April. And due to coronavirus and everything, this talk was canceled. But since I already written the talk, I adapted just a few little things that had to be done a little different on video versus live, and I presented it here. Hopefully it helps you of any Christian denomination. This was supposed to be a national conference on inclusion in all Christian churches together. Most of my videos on this channel, if you want to keep up with it, are more specifically on Catholicism and autism, different aspects like prayer, sensory assisted mass, and things like that. I think a lot of it would apply pretty well to other Christians, but this one was much more explicitly talking to a wider Christian audience, whereas many of the other videos you'd have to implicitly use certain things because I don't refer to worship service, I refer to Catholic Mass and things like that. But if you want to, please subscribe. If you like the shirt, you can buy it. There's also one that says Autistic Catholic on it. God bless you.